What is going on, Fantasy Fam? Welcome to the Week 16 edition of Plugged In. I am your host slash guest, JM to Win, here with my guest slash host, Scott Barrett. Scott, my man, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, JM.
You feeling
Merry
energized
Christmas.
with the last stretch of the season in place for us?
Yeah, I think Thursday is going to be like the worst day of my year where I have to cram in an article that usually takes me 2 full days into one day.
Yeah.
But
You
it's also my
usually
girlfriend's birthday, so it just
Oh,
adds
nice.
flex on
Not your
everything.
girlfriend anymore.
But
um,
yeah,
you have a lot of playoff content too, don't you?
yeah, I do some of that, but definitely DFS is my focus
Yeah.
this
So I mean,
season.
it's lighter at that point. I have like practically no playoff content on my end, so I'm kind of like really on the stretch run myself. But yeah, it's an interesting week, right? We've got the slate is playing out on Christmas Eve, the main slate, and then 3 games on Christmas Day. Obviously, one would assume that a lot of our competition will A, still be playing, and B, maybe putting in a little bit less time or focus or effort or energy than they typically do. But obviously, the only way to take advantage of that is to still put in our own typical amount of effort and focus and energy and be as prepared for the slate as we can be. Interesting slate this week with potential weather, and I think it's supposed to be like -6 degrees in Kansas City, and supposed to be blizzard concerns in Chicago, some injury issues as well. Jalen Hurts unlikely to play this week. But first, let's take a look back at this last week. How was this last week for you from a DFS perspective, from a football perspective, from a holistic life perspective? Anything you want to share?
Just like on the weather concerns, yeah, I saw a funny tweet. I think it's from Ian Hart. It's kind of touching on this, but like, I wonder if I could go back in time and like I knew what profession I'd actually be doing if I could have, instead of majoring in philosophy and political science, majored in meteorology or just like data programming and learn code and uh, machine learning and things like that to like better help me. Yeah, I don't really know what to do with the cold. I looked at the data at some point and it says like cold's pretty overrated, wind is super underrated. Snow is, depends on how much snow there is, but if there's a lot of snow, you bump the running backs, kind of downgrade everyone else. How was this week for me? It was a great week. We're on a hot streak. We've had a sub win at least 100K from one tournament in 3 straight weeks. I did really well. It was another one of those weeks where I finished in the top 2, top 3, top 5% of everything, but nothing in the top 0.01%. And I nailed a lot of like key pieces. We talked about Jerick McKinnon, who I kept incorrectly calling JD McKissick because they're sort of the same player.
You were just throwing everybody off the scent.
We talked about that on the show last week. And then I had Zay Jones as a top 5 play. I also wrote a note and I put it on my desk to prioritize him over Chris Moore and to not forget about him when I was building my lineups. And then I, of course, forgot about him when I was building my lineups. I had one lineup, which I just beat myself up over the entire day for doing that. But yeah, it ended up being a really strong week. Could have been, insane week had I had the appropriate levels of Zay Jones exposure that I wanted. I had 63% Jerick McKinnon and 0% JD McKissick, so that definitely helped out.
Yeah, the Zay Jones one, I wanted to pause on that for a moment because we talk sometimes about our biases on players, and I think you and I talked last week about Zay Jones' crazy, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, about Zay Jones' crazy career journey where he was a second rounder for the Bills, is that right? And then obviously kind of never panned out for them. Had some spiked weeks relative to his expectations in that Josh Allen rookie year, but then really got buried on the depth chart there and had that bizarre offseason incident that one time. And then he went to the Raiders and had some big games, and it seemed very fluky. And then the Jags signed him to like a contract with actual money involved. And again, people were like, oh, the stupid Jags, what are they doing? And then he started the season obviously priced under 4K for most of the season. And yet every week he pops in projections as one of the top plays, and he pops in projected ownership early in the week. And then as it becomes clear, like, oh, people aren't actually going to select Zay Jones, he trickles down. But I think that if he'd been carrying a price, like if he started the year at 5K and then they had gradually bumped him up to like 6K, he would still be pretty appropriately priced. And our perception of him would be more of like a 5K player who's now 6K, as opposed to a 3.4K player who's now 4.9K, right? That pricing psychology definitely sways things, because I had a big weekend a few weeks ago, the last time Zay Jones hit, at like really low ownership. And then this week I opened DraftKings shortly after kickoff and see that Zay Jones is like almost 20% owned in most contests. And I had no Zay Jones, but I had a lot of Drake London. I had some Jacoby Myers and obviously a decent chunk of Chris Moore. And then it's like, well, wouldn't I rather have, maybe not Jacoby Myers, right? But wouldn't I rather have Zay Jones than these other guys? And, and then also, Mike Johnson wrote up this last week, that game is a potential shootout, talked about the Dallas defense being kind of banged up and not being as scary as people think, and how well Trevor Lawrence has been playing lately. And so, yeah, just a spot that I totally missed on this last week, but I was thinking about the cognitive biases that we have around that particular player. And it's interesting to explore how those biases are built, and then also to recognize a spot where it's like, yeah, I was just off this guy and he was a better play than some of these other guys that I was on. So great call on that one. Also great call on Jerick McKinnon, not just obviously highlighting the play, but also pulling the trigger on that play, because that's sometimes the hardest thing to do, is then to actually pull the trigger on those ones. Yeah. Anything else from this last week and from your builds, from your play, that stands out?
Yeah, I think we talked about it last week. If not, I just talked about it in every piece of my content, which was how Derrick Henry was the most game script sensitive player in fantasy by a landslide, but how he was also one of the most matchup sensitive, which is something you put me onto initially. And this is a great matchup against the Chargers defense that ranks worst in yards per carry allowed, although that is sort of like schematically intentional. So maybe they sell out to stop the pass instead of the run, but maybe they go the opposite route this week. But in the article, I talked about how he had, 15, 30 plus games throughout his career, but the most fantasy points he ever scored in a non-overtime loss was just like 24.2 DraftKings fantasy points. So playing Henry is basically betting on a victory. And then he ended up smashing that. He scored, 29 DraftKings fantasy points, his most ever in a non-overtime loss. And then, of course, this week, like the nuts matchup against the Texans, where they're favored by 7. I also want to touch on Justin Fields, who I had a ton of exposure. I was sitting about 4%, and this is something we talk about constantly, where it's like, what's his had to have it potential? What percentage odds of him posting a had to have it score? And he has 2 40-plus point games this season. He was only 4% owned. So I had a ton of Justin Fields. Johnny Proctor on Saturday night or Sunday morning was like, why is no one playing Justin Fields? I'm going all in. Like, he's amazing. A great play. And it didn't hit. He finished with 95 rushing yards. He suffered an injury late in the game. He also just barely stepped out on a play that would have added, 10 more points to his total. But outside of that, I did have Hurts QB1, Mahomes QB2. Really, the combination of Henry and McKinnon carried me in a lot of spots. I did have one lineup I really liked that didn't hit that I wanted to touch on. You and I constantly build or try and find these builds. And just for me, like, it never works, where you go like really unorthodox and super top heavy on a few key guys. And just for me, every time I do this, like the guys I'm paying up for, it's like, oh, this is so unique. No one's going to have Mahomes, Henry, Chase, and Jacobs, or Mahomes, Henry, Chase, and Kelsey. And so I had that lineup with McKinnon in it. and I was feeling so good about it. And then it didn't really pay off. You just barely finished in the money. But I love building teams like that, and I think I'm definitely going that route this week. Good news for you, good news for listeners of the show is I spent all yesterday writing. I didn't give myself a day off, so I'm gonna have some good stats and some good thoughts on the week moving forward. But yeah, any thoughts on that? And how was your week, by the way?
Yeah, my week was bad, and I wouldn't say it was a bad week of play. I'd say it was. So let's see. Over the last 6 weeks I've played, I've had 3 really strong weeks of results, 1 huge week of results, I guess 2 huge weeks of results, and then a 4th week that wasn't great results, but it was really strong play, and then a 5th week that was poor results and poor play. And then this last week kind of fell somewhere in the middle. But I think that this was the type of slate, there's everybody has different slates to kind of line up for their style of play or what they look for, how they approach things. And so this last week was not a week that set up well for me. And so that was one of the kind of frustrating elements, in that when you put in a lot of work and then the week ends and it's like, oh, I played poorly, you can look back and it's, for me, it's easier to turn the page because you kind of learn from whatever mistakes that you made, right? And you're like, okay, I made these mistakes. I'll know to not make them next time. And then obviously if you played really well, but you had a bad weekend, to me, I can turn the page very quickly on that, because it's just like, okay, it just didn't work out. This last weekend, it was one where I spent an enormous amount of time on the slate and then didn't get it right, and then felt like it was just like a weekend that didn't line up perfectly for my style of play, and yet I was close to getting it right. And so it was like, still ends up being kind of a frustrating thing, and took a little bit longer for me to turn the page than normal. I wasn't on McKinnon. I'm actually interested in picking your brains a little bit on that one. But one of the things that did a really good job at this last week was avoiding the high-owned duds. And I did a great job when it came down to it of like recognizing from a strategic standpoint of where I wanted to avoid certain high-owned guys. So like Miles Sanders, you know me, I'm a big Miles Sanders guy. Was on him the previous week at no ownership, and he was predicting for like 8% early in the week, and then 10%, 11% deeper into the week. But everything I read was people being like, Miles Sanders, like, people aren't going to be on him and you should be on him, right? And I was like, he's going to be a lot higher owned than we're thinking. And he still needs a 2 touchdown game in order to go for 30 plus points in his role, right? He's a yardage and touchdown back. And so it was like, if he's going to be 20% owned, 25% owned, do I want to bet on him having a 2 touchdown game at that ownership, right? So I was mostly off of Miles Sanders on my tighter build. Might have been 100% off of Miles Sanders on my tighter builds. No Kamara on my tighter builds. No Pacheco on my tighter builds. And then some other, popular wide receivers who Keenan Allen's always going to be popular. CeeDee Lamb's always going to be popular. Guys I'm not typically going to play because they don't have the ceiling I'm looking for in most game environment scenarios. CeeDee Lamb could have actually hit in that game environment the way it played out. But yeah, I did a great job kind of avoiding the guys who were going to miss, but I wasn't quite able to get onto the guys who hit, right? And so I had Derrick Henry on most of my tighter builds, and I had a lot of Jamar Chase. But yeah, I was just like trying to figure out, where do I spend the salary? I had a sense that I didn't have any Garrett Wilson on my tighter builds, but I had a sense that like the 30 pointers, it was another week with very few 30 pointers. But unlike the week before where I said like, hey, look, the only place we're getting 30 pointers are like Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jamar Chase. And so I'm going to get all these guys on our roster together. Miles Sanders, I'm going to get all these guys on our roster together. This week it was like, I didn't think that the only 30 pointers were going to be at the top of the price range. And so I just couldn't figure out where they were going to be, right? So I had a lot of Mike Williams. I should have had a little bit more Mike Evans than I ended up having. He was another guy I liked. But I was kind of like, hey, maybe Mike Williams at 6,300, maybe Mike Evans at 6,200. There was a few other guys, right, were kind of cheaper guys that I tried to target big scores from them, but didn't end up on Zay Jones or Jerick McKinnon on my tighter builds. And so that was really the difference there, right? Had Greg Dulcich on my main roster, which retrospectively not the best play, just because we would expect this to be a lower scoring game, and therefore the Broncos would keep the ball on the ground a lot. I paired him with Chigo Okonkwo in a double tight end build, and that was the only Dulcich exposure I had on my tighter builds, was my main roster. But yeah, I finished like 8 points out of the money on my main roster, maybe like 6 points out of the money on my main roster. So not bad, right? But it was just like I put in so much work, and I avoided all of these high-owned duds on the early slate. And then like 7 of my guys were on the late slate. I had Burrow on my main build, which I really liked that. as a way that most people wouldn't be going. They'd be going Herbert for 200 more. And so, yeah, it was frustrating to kind of come into the late games. I had 7 players left on my main build. I had like 5 to 7 players left on most of my builds. And then it just didn't play out in my favor, right? Where I missed all these high-owned duds, but then I still didn't hit on the guys that I had. So that was kind of the weekend for me. Let's talk about McKinnon, because something that Cubs fan has talked about for years is this value of pass-catching running backs, that they're always played at a lower rate than their hit rate is, right? And so I've taken advantage of that over the years with J.D. McKissic, in weeks where it's like, hey, you know what? Washington's going to be passing a decent amount here, and nobody plays J.D. McKissic, and he can go for 20 or 30 in these games where they have to pass the ball. Jerick McKinnon obviously had played kind of ahead of Pacheco the week before. It seemed a little bit game script and matchup sensitive to me, but also whenever a guy hits, it's harder for me to pull the trigger on him the next week, right? Because I always think like, oh, well, am I just pushing this button because this guy just hit? The week before, was week 14. I really liked Jags pass catchers because they were playing Tennessee, and it was like, there's going to be a ton of volume. I was on a lot of Zay. I was on a lot of Christian Kirk, but I didn't play Evan Ingram. And I kept seeing Ingram and being like, oh, I should play some Ingram. But then it was like, oh, he scored 14 points last week, and I'm just clicking this button because he just scored 14 points, right? And then he goes out and puts up over 40. And so, yeah, it's something like McKinnon was harder for me because it was like, am I just pushing this button because he just had a big game? On the flip side, I knew that he wasn't going to be high owned, right? There's certain players who they have a big game and people are just like, oh, I missed it. It was fluky, and they don't go to them the next week. And very much McKinnon fell into that category. So what was the thought process on McKinnon? Like you said, you were over 60% exposed to him. So really sharp call on your end. Really like that play. It's just a guy I didn't end up pulling the trigger on myself.
Well, I should have been on him the week earlier too, because our guy Chris Wecht was hammering what I think is the key stat on McKinnon. And I looked at him, I thought about him, I didn't play him. And then everything he said was true and just reinforced, and no one wanted to play him. Everyone wanted to play Pacheco. Even like the guys who brand themselves as contrarian guys were hyping up Pacheco and ignoring McKinnon. And so to me, it was a combination of multiple factors. It's okay, the Chiefs are 14-point favorites. Look at what the Chiefs have done every single game. They've been favored by 10 or more points in the post-Kareem Hunt era, and they never run the ball. You always like want them to run the ball, think they're going to run the ball. They never run the ball, where basically Mahomes averages like 28 fantasy points per game in those games, and the RB1 averages 9. An RB1 has hit 3x Pacheco's salary just once in those, 12 games. And the running backs collectively average like 47 rushing yards per game. What it came down to me was, again, ownership. But so prior to last week and the 2 weeks before that, McKinnon handled 63% of the backfield XFP, 88% of the backfield XTD. He's played on 79% of the team's red zone snaps. Pacheco was just at 16%. And so Kansas City had this 32-point implied total. He had, in my opinion, all of the touchdown upside, and he was going to get the bulk of the work. Like, I get the ground game matchup was excellent. The spread was matchup. But again, it's price, 5,200. It's ownership and just massive touchdown upside. I may have also run hot here because Pacheco did fumble, I think, early in the game. But I just never run hot. So I just like choose to believe that it was just a good call. But it's possible I also ran hot. Well,
he fumbled, and they put in Ronald Jones for like a series. And I think that Pacheco was back in the next series, or at least the next series. I mean, I don't think that necessarily influenced things that much. And he was in his normal role, right? I don't think people realize that Pacheco's not the lead back here. He's the ground back, right? And that like you said,
he's the ground back inside the 20s, which is like not a valuable role at all.
Right. Yeah, and he's just like yardage, and he has, I think, 3 touchdowns on the year, right? He can certainly score, but if you look at like his pre-touchdown fantasy scoring, he does need a 2-touchdown game just to hit value, right? Just to hit 4x, and in the role that he has, and the chance of him having a 2-touchdown game are obviously very low.
Not at 16% of the team's red zone snaps. There's like zero multiple touchdowns.
And at like such high ownership. What's great about the McKinnon play too is even if they've been splitting red zone work down the middle, not only are you getting the McKinnon points, but every point that he's getting is taking away points from a super popular player, which just makes it that much more likely that you finish in first place or finish with a really nice weekend. So yeah, really sharp call on your end there. And that's one of those ones that, especially when I'm focused on tighter builds, I'm always focused on what is the most upside I can get with the lowest chance of a dud, which is why it felt great to avoid like the Kamara dud and the Pacheco dud and the Miles Sanders dud, because then I'm like, cool. And I avoided those duds, and then I'm building with pieces that have like a lower chance of a dud and still the same ceiling that everybody else thought they were targeting. And so it was a spot where it was like the fact that all my guys kind of dudded or came close to posting duds, I was like, well, come on. Like I spent all that time avoiding these duds and these guys still hit. But then because of that, like the Jerick McKinnons are guys that I sometimes don't swing toward as quickly. And so that's why I said it was a slate that didn't set up as well for me. And yet, like I felt like I was close to getting to the pieces that ended up coming together. Right. So yeah, I feel like, and that's one of the things that I'm working on is like, hey, how do I win on the slates that don't set up as well for me, especially if I can identify in advance that they don't set up as well for me. Like I said, this last week, like 2 weeks ago when I had the huge weekend, it was a perfect weekend for me because the high priced guys, like the fact that the only places where I saw 30 pointers were these high priced guys, and I can figure out how to put together that roster. Whereas this one where it's like, you might need some 5K guys, some 4K guys to find your 30 pointers. That one's a little bit harder for me. And so that's one that I'm like working to get better at, I guess, on my end. And maybe next time we have a weekend like that, we need to have our Saturday call and I can pick your brains about the McKinnons and the Zay Joneses and get those guys on my roster. So what was the deal with Zay Jones with you not ending up pulling the trigger on that one? Is that just one of those where, because I know what that's like, right? You talk about a guy, you leave a note for yourself, and then you force yourself to put him on one roster, but then you're like, well, why didn't I just play him on a bunch, right? Is that just that sort of thing where you're like, there's no way I'm this right about this guy, and you just end up not on him?
No, so I wanted him on a ton of rosters, like maybe not a ton, but like 30%, because again, I had him as a top 5 overall wide receiver play, same price just about as Chris Moore, who everyone loved. Even, and I get the arguments on Chris Moore, but it's still a player who has 3 50-yard games and an 82-game career. Where Zay Jones, we know, has a slate busting upside, even though I don't think he's a really good football player. There's also the Trevor Lawrence argument. I wrote up Trevor Lawrence, then I deleted it just because I thought the narrative on him was counter to like a really compelling one that I crafted. And like those are my favorite plays, where it's just like, okay, he's been playing out of his mind, but he also had the softest quarterback schedule over the past 6 weeks. And this was a brutal matchup against the Cowboys. But yeah, so I view our time together, JM, somewhat selfishly, where it's like I'm paying you to be my DFS tutor for an hour every week.
Except I'm not getting paid either, am I?
Yeah, you're not even getting paid, right? So it's just like a great deal for me. So this was the notes I left for myself on Sunday. Is okay, can I get a free lineup building tutorial, because I liked Zay Jones. I wrote a note to myself to play Zay Jones, and then I start building lineups and I just forget about it. I double check the lineups, I forget about it. I check it Sunday morning, I forget about it. And then the other one was, again, I finished top 2, top 3, top 5% in just about everything. And do you have any thoughts on contest selection? I talked to John Proctor about this. He's like, you're just like entering way too big tournaments, like the blind side or whatever. He recommended playing the goal line, which is, I think, $75 to entry, but it's just like 750 total teams. So yeah, can I get a JM to win masterclass on contest selection and lineup building? How do I make sure I don't forget a Zay Jones again?
Yeah, that's something I'd like to know for myself too, because sometimes I do that, right? You're just like, hey, this guy, and then, but for me, it's more like I don't forget the guy. It's just like I can't pull the trigger on him, right? Where it's like he just makes so much sense, and then you're like, okay, let me make sure. And it's every week this season where I've been like Devontae or Jacobs, right? Not every week, but almost every week, I'm overweight on the guy who underscores the other guy, right? Because the guy who's like a little bit less comfortable to pull the trigger on, and you're like, okay, I'm going to go 50-50. And then you're like, yeah, but Jacobs is in the better spot. So I'll go 60-40. And then you end up like 65-35. And then Devontae's the one with the big game. I think those things just happen. On contest selection, Yeah, I mean, I'm with Johnny on this. Like, and it's just like different rosters need to be built differently, right? But when I play, there's three different power sweeps. There's like the 400K power sweep, the 200K power sweep, and the 100K power sweep. I think of the three sizes. The power sweep's $150 buy-in, 3 max. Usually I'll play 2 power sweeps, but if I just play one, I always play the smallest one, which is 740 entries. And that's because my like main thoughts toward main builds are going toward the game changer, which is like 340 to 370 entries. And then like the spy and the double spy, like the smaller spies are like several hundred entries, right? And then you have to the spies that are like 1,000 entries, and then they have some that are a couple thousand entries. And so I kind of like my approach for those contests is very different from a contest that would have 10,000 entries, or the slant where there's 26,000 entries. So I very much divide up my thinking into like my high dollar, smaller field contest, which is typically going to be sub 1K entries. And then my large field play, which is going to be 26,000 entries in the slant, or however many entries there are on a given week. But yeah, and it's like this approach of, like I said, the highest, like the lowest chance of a dud with the highest upside. And what's great about that is people kind of overlook the importance of not getting duds on a roster. And I'll look at it like this. Like I finished third in the game changer 2 weeks ago and had James Cook on that roster, right? You can take one dud and still do really well. You can't take 2 duds. And so if you position a roster to where it has like 4 or 5 guys who can end up as duds, and you're in these smaller field contests, well, now it's just so much harder for you to have positive ROI over time. And so for a player like you and me, right, where we know so much about the NFL, and sometimes we have to separate what we know from the NFL from like what we know about how to play DFS, it's harder to pull the triggers on the riskier guys or the higher upside guys. And so it's almost like we can play to our personality type and our knowledge by saying, okay, cool, like I'll focus on these smaller field contests where that knowledge is more powerful, because you can also recognize like, okay, this guy has this, like you still have to think ceiling, but it's like this guy has this ceiling, this other guy has this ceiling, but this other guy, his chances of disappointing are so much lower. So like if both guys disappoint, right, well, this guy, I'm still on track to finish in first place because it's like my one dud. Or whereas this guy, or I can take 2 guys who score like 12 to 15 points, right? But if I take 2 guys who score 3 to 5 points, well, now my weekend's over. And so, yeah, the smaller field contest is just like a very different approach. Whereas the larger field contest, the larger and larger it gets, the more willing you have to be on these guys who are just like sort of way off the board, right? Where they're low owned, maybe because they should be low owned. They're low owned because they have these like a big upside, like a big ceiling. Maybe they're the 3K guy who has a 20-point ceiling, but he's going to dud most of the time. I don't want that guy on my tighter build if I can avoid it. But on my tighter builds, you can be like, okay, well, how much floor am I building in? And then make sure I still have that 200+ point ceiling. So yeah, I mean, I'm with Johnny on that one, especially for like how much you know about the NFL. It helps a little bit to kind of get into those contests. But I mean, we've talked about this too, right? Like once you're hitting, it becomes so much easier to keep hitting because you're on you've been on a hot streak, like you've been seeing things well, you've been putting together good rosters, and that gives you so much more confidence when you go into build to pull the trigger. Like if this had been a month ago, you might not have played as much Jerick McKinnon because you might have been like, well, the numbers say this, but like everybody else is saying this, right? What if I'm wrong on this? So then I'll go in this other direction. Whereas at this point, you're like, boom, Jerick McKinnon, throw him in there. Maybe even mixing a JD McKissick just to throw everybody off. But yeah, I think that's a big part of things too, is having that confidence of which, again, it can be built up without hitting. But once you are hitting, it just is so much easier to be like, okay, cool, I'm probably right on this. And if I'm wrong, well, that's cool. I hit the last few weeks. So, but yeah, hopefully like what would be ideal is you've hit some solid weeks. That's what, I had a few solid weeks and had a huge weekend not last weekend, but the weekend before week 14. Hopefully you can kind of snowball this into like a huge weekend this weekend, and then it justifies missing your girlfriend's birthday and working right up to Christmas and all that. So yeah, that's the ideal on your end.
Yeah, just to answer my own question with like better at lineup building, what I was doing a few weeks ago was I downloaded the Roto Grinders tool, I don't know, years ago, but it tracks like your ownership across multiple lineups. And then I pull up my article where I have all these players ranked in order, and I just cross-reference, and it's like, okay, this guy is my number 4 play at the position. but I only have one lineup. Let me bump that. I think I should have done that, taking the time last week to do that, but I did not. As to your other point is, yeah, I am noticing that, where it's like the more confidence I'm getting, the more risk tolerant I'm becoming, and the greater the results. And this is something we've been preaching since week one, but to actually do that, actually go there and make those changes and steps and embrace risk, it's a different thing. But the results have clearly been there. And I definitely feel like I'm going to be even more risk tolerant this week. And I feel really good about it. So we could start talking about week 16 whenever you want.
Yeah, I'm good with that. One thing I do want to mention, which has nothing specifically to do with DFS, but this last weekend was like the weekend of the epic collapses, right? We had the Colts giving up, what was it, the largest comeback in NFL history. Shout out to Matt Ryan there. Shout out to Jeff Saturday for just refusing to throw the ball at any point in the second half of that game. I took a nap and woke up, and Matt Ryan still had like the same number of passing yards as he had when I went to sleep, and then the score was much closer. And then obviously the Bucks blowing a 17-0 lead against the Bengals. Eli Apple talking trash, telling Tom Brady that the future is now, old man. So yeah, just a really interesting week around the NFL. Excited for this week, where we've got this interesting 10-game slate on Christmas Eve. As we already noted, right, it looks like Buffalo could have the Bills could have a hard time just getting into Chicago with this expected blizzard, and then it could be impacting that game. We could have Gardner Minshew playing for the Eagles. We could have sub-0 degree weather in Kansas City, though, as you pointed out, that's not as big of a deal as people make it out to be. And then it's a slate with a decent number of elite quarterbacks on the slate. We have Lamar Jackson should be coming back. Joe Burrow is on this slate against the Patriots defense that people are scared of because they're a good defense, but they're not like a scary defense from a DFS production standpoint in passing attacks. So I think that's an interesting spot. And then we have Deshaun Watson, who I think people just don't want to play, but he's down at 6K against the Saints. And I know that the Browns are really leaning into the run here and trying to kind of hide him. And can the Saints really make this a game? Who knows? But spread is only 2.5 points, right? But if the Saints had a lead, it could force the Browns to throw the ball a little bit more. I think that's an interesting spot. So yeah, that's kind of my overview thoughts on this week's slate. You've done a lot more research on this slate than I have. So fire away. What do you have on this one?
Yeah, my first take was that I need 100% exposure to Derrick Henry. Okay, he's going to be super chalky. Well, I'm just going to have 100%. And then it was, I want 100% exposure to Christian McCaffrey. And it's like, oh, okay, well, he's super chalky. But it's like, I don't care. I want 100%. Maybe having both on 100% of my lineups is going to give me a unique build. And I just love it. I love everything about that. We talk about Henry being the most game script sensitive player in fantasy by a landslide. They're favored by 7 points. He's one of the most matchup sensitive players in fantasy. This matchup couldn't be better. Texans rank worst in rushing fantasy points per game allowed. He averages 220 rushing yards per game over his last 4 games against the Texans. So you're in this scenario where he does look a little cheap. He's what, 8,300, something like that?
8,600, yeah.
8,600, but this is a player with a legitimate 30-point projection, and you never get that, especially at the running back position, where if you throw out Christian McCaffrey, his projection should be 30% higher than anyone else this week. And so to me, it feels like a throwback. I mean, just imagine Derrick Henry if Tennessee's defense was just league average or where they were last year rather than nearly worse in the league this year. He could be averaging like 28 fantasy points per game this year, one of the best seasons ever. And so, yeah, again, like this is a throwback to old seasons, it feels like, where it's just like there's these oligarch running backs where these top 3 with massive projections, and there's everyone else where there's a lot more uncertainty, a lot lower ceiling, a lot lower median projection. And so I want 100% exposure. But then, I dug into Christian McCaffrey, who you look at his usage, you look at his production in games with the 49ers and without Elijah Mitchell. And it's another player who's averaging 30 fantasy points per game, 80% snap share. 73% route share, nearly 20 carries per game, 7.5 targets per game. Best, like, compare that to any other running back. He's better by 30% in XFP per game, 35% or 40% in fantasy points per game. And this is another player I just want to go all in on. And so I'm excited to just go have just lean into this upside. Hope this is somewhat unique. And obviously it's going to force me into an uncomfortable position with the rest of my build where I'll have to go cheaper, but it's like, all right, you know what, YOLO. I like the Washington wide receivers. I'm going to have, I think, one on every single lineup, maybe at max one or at least one. I like Gardner Minshew. I like a lot of cheap plays this week, right? I think people are going to miss.
Yeah, so I've got a new roster building show. If you are listening to this, if you want to check it out, it's called DFS Lab. You can find it on YouTube on the 1 Week Season YouTube channel. But Scott, if you haven't checked it out, it's I'm doing it with my nephew Keegan, and he's like super into DFS, but just got into it last year. So it's kind of a cool show because he's able to drive the roster build. We're doing it every day. And then I'm able to kind of like ask questions or challenge him on things, and we're able to talk strategy and theory. But we built a roster this morning, and it had, what's interesting, you talk about the salary savers, right? Well, it had Derrick Henry, it had Alvin Kamara, it had Amon-Ra St. Brown, it had DK Metcalf, all on a roster together. And we were able to still feel good about like the ceiling that we had in our other spots, right? I mean, we had Noah Fant at tight end, where you're talking about if Tyler Lockett's out, Seattle's going to be chasing points. And these concentrated offenses, we've talked about some of my rosters this year, some of Osmo's rosters this year that have just leaned into these concentrated offenses, whether it's the Dolphins or whether it's the Raiders, and just saying the value of just knowing where the points are coming from is so great, or the value of knowing how a team is going to attack is so great. So talk about teams against the Titans, where it's like you literally can't worry. You don't have to worry about the run game against the Titans because you can't run the ball against them. And so you just know that things are going to flow through the air. And so, yeah, I think that this is an interesting week where you can find some lower cost guys who have a lot of ceiling, and then you can fit in, you wouldn't be able to go Henry and Christian McCaffrey and like two other high priced guys, but you could go Henry and Christian McCaffrey and one other high priced guy for sure. And in fact, maybe you could go two, because Amon-Ra St. Brown, 7,800, Christian McCaffrey's 8,800. We were able to pull off the Amon-Ra St. Brown one. On Derrick Henry, another thing I like too is you can't run the ball against Tennessee. So the Tennessee has the opportunities to get the ball back more quickly, right? Either the opponent scores, which is probably going to happen with Houston, or the opponent is turning the ball, or like having to punt quickly, a 3 and out because they're trying to run the ball, or they're passing the ball and there are more incompletion. So there's more stop clock and more opportunities for plays for Tennessee. Also, Derrick Henry, 4 catches for 59 yards last week, 3 catches for 34 the week before. 2 weeks before that, 3 for 79. The week before that, 2 for 45. And I don't think people necessarily realize how big of a part of the passing attack he's become on this offense. He's not just the guy who could get you 200 yards on the ground now, but he could also add another 7 or 8 points through the air, which is different from in the past. Last week, I was digging into those Derrick Henry game logs again, and I think it was of his 10 games of like 38 plus DraftKings points, 6 of them have come against division opponents. And so again, it's this thing where we see it's like the Titans are built, they build their team to be able to beat the Jags and the Texans and the Colts on the ground. Even this Colts team that has year in and year out has a really good run defense. Year in and year out, Derrick Henry posts really big games against them. And so, it's one of those spots where what I said on the show with Keegan this morning was, there are certain spots where you just say, this guy will be chalky, but I think I'll probably need him. And so I'll ride the chalk here, right? And then also, if you're able to fit in the Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey together, automatically it's unique. Automatically you're doing something that other people won't be able to do because they're not really once they get that Derrick Henry, it's like, okay, how do I get as many of these 5 to 6K guys in here as I can get? Whereas if we're like, yeah, but the 30 pointers are up here, then you get this unique build. So yeah, I think that there's some interesting things that you can do this week. I think that Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, clearly a tier above Saquon Barkley, Nick Chubb, Dalvin Cook, Ramondre Stevenson, not quite in their class, although certainly a strong play. a class above Tony Pollard in terms of workload, Joe Mixon in terms of workload, David Montgomery, Kenneth Walker in a negative game script. What are your thoughts on Kamara, who had 21 carries, 2 catches last week? Saints won, so they're technically still in the playoff hunt where they can catch the Bucks. No reason for them to not ride Kamara heavily in this spot against the bad Cleveland run defense, game where the Saints are only 2.5-point underdogs. So do you have any thoughts on Kamara? Assuming that, like, even if you're playing McCaffrey, Henry, you can fit in, a third running back in the flex. You could fit in a guy at this price tag. So do you have any thoughts on Kamara as kind of like a number 3 guy, or are you likely to go different directions there?
Yeah, so Kamara was really interesting to me. He was a player I spent a lot of time on. The narrative on him I thought was like totally wrong, where it's like, oh, he's a great play because Ingram is on IR. He's going to get all of the work. Okay, well, over his last prior 4 games, he handled 95%, 87%, 91%, and then 42% of the backfield XFP. Those were all top 3 numbers minus the Mark Ingram week. And so it's like, well, he was already seeing amazing usage, but he had over the span 1 game over 9 fantasy points. So like that just seemed like a bad narrative to me. But the narrative I crafted to argue in his favor was that he easily had the worst schedule over the span. 4 games, 3 of which were he had, counting backwards, he had the 5th toughest, 6th toughest, 17th toughest, and 9th toughest matchups. But over the prior 4 games, he had 3 top 5 matchups, and he averaged 26.5 DK fantasy points per game with a low of 17.5. And this narrative was neutral at worst, but potentially top 10 based on some recent stuff you could look at. And so that's what I thought was the narrative. But like my overarching take was, I don't really care. I think he's hurt. I seriously think just the fact that New Orleans would give a 33-year-old Mark Ingram so much more volume, the lead in the backfield makes me think he's hurt. And like throughout his career, Kamara has only ever finished top 15 all time in fantasy points per touch 3 seasons, where he's been well below average in his other 3 seasons where he's like very clearly hurt. And so I just don't trust him. I think he's hurt. And then what happened? So Mark Ingram ran more routes than Alvin Kamara. Last week, David freaking Johnson ran more routes than Alvin Kamara. There's only 2 possible explanations, which is gross coaching incompetence or he's hurt. And I don't think any coach is this incompetent. So I really just think he's hurt. And I'm probably not going to play him.
On top of that, he has like, I don't remember the exact numbers, but basically no red zone usage like all season, which I think is interesting. And if you talk about, is he potentially hurt? Well, that's one of the easiest ways to keep a guy healthy or to prevent him from getting more hurt is not having him get those touches inside the 10-yard line, right? Where all the bodies are clumped up. You're going to take bigger hits. You're going to take more hits. And so I think that's an interesting angle there. I ended up off of him because of his previous 8 games against Atlanta, division opponent, obviously build their defense around the teams they're going to face. His best score against Atlanta in his previous 8 games was like 22 DraftKings points. And that was on some really good Saints teams, some really bad Atlanta defenses. And it was like, well, if he's going to be 30% owned and his chances of going for 30 points are so low where he's not getting red zone touches and he's playing a defense that knows how to attack him and he's on this offense that really isn't scoring a lot of points, it was pretty easy for me to avoid. But I think that's a sharp call even this week where I think he's interesting this week, right? Like I'm not totally removing him from my list, but I think he's definitely a guy who has a lower shot at hitting that type of ceiling than people would expect. And is maybe because of that, when we talk about the differentiation between large field stuff and small field stuff, large field stuff, I couldn't care less about floor, right? Because it's like, you got to beat so many rosters that where's my highest ceiling? And I don't even think about floor, but smaller field stuff, that's where I start thinking like, and how do I avoid the duds? Because again, like I said, my James Cook roster was still able to finish third, and that was like a total dud. So if you take a couple mini duds, you can still get up to the top of these smaller field contests. And so thinking about how to avoid duds is also important. And so a guy like Kamara probably becomes a little bit less interesting to me in that type of format. So if you end up going high price running back, you could end up boxing yourself out of the high price wide receivers which Diggs against Chicago in this snowstorm, probably not that scary to avoid. Jamar Chase against the Patriots, he can still put up 30 points, but his chances of like a 40-pointer in this spot where the Patriots aren't going to be pushing them. You got Devin McCourty patrolling the deep end of that secondary, pretty low. A.J. Brown with Gardner Minshew, that's an interesting one because Gardner Minshew can kind of Brock Purdy the game and distribute the ball to A.J. Brown. Amon-Ra St. Brown can certainly still put up a 30-pointer, but I think his chances of doing that are a little bit overstated by the field, right? I think he has 3 games this year north of 25 DraftKings points. 3 games this year north of 25 DraftKings points. Those were a 40-point game against Jacksonville, but then a shootout against Buffalo, a shootout against Washington. So yeah, any thoughts on the fact that you might be kind of boxing yourself out of some of these higher priced wide receivers? And then another question on top of that is, if we get below these 8K wide receivers, you can certainly fit in some 7K guys. So any thoughts on DK Metcalf without Tyler Lockett against Kansas City? Any thoughts on Devontae Smith, who I think is being highly underrated right now? I had a Jalen Hurts, Devontae Smith stack that did well in the power sweep this last week. So yeah, any thoughts on some of these kind of, hey, where maybe I can't get an 8.8K wide receiver, but if I miss out on Justin Jefferson, as long as he doesn't bury me, maybe I can get some of these 6K, 7K guys who could put up a big game. Also, Amari Cooper's 5,900. This guy was putting up 26 pointers left and right with Jacoby Brissett. Eventually, he's going to have a big game with Deshaun Watson. But yeah, any thoughts on the wide receiver position if you're ending up boxing yourself in at running back like that?
Yeah, I really like Amari Cooper. He's at home, which I think is a crucial point. I don't know why this is the case, but throughout his entire career, he averages like 15 more DraftKings fantasy points per game at home. This is more.
He's got a sleep number bed. Dak sold him on it. He got a sleep number bed.
It's either that or he's just like cheating on his wife like crazy, where he's out of the clubs till like 4 a.m. But yeah, it's bizarre. It's like more exaggerated than the Ben Roethlisberger splits. But that was my immediate thought, was just like, who is the only guy who really scares me? And it's Justin Jefferson at 9,300 against the Giants. I also like Dalvin Cook. It's a great matchup for Dalvin Cook. Volume has been obscene. It's been due for a positive regression for a while. He had a 90 week, 90 rushing yards, 90 receiving yards last week, but still didn't really super smash in terms of production. You mentioned DK Metcalf. I like DK Metcalf. I also think Marquise Goodwin is like a strong value. There's a lot of strong values. Jahan Dotson, if you just look at games where he's cleared a 66% snap share, he's putting up fringe wide receiver 1 numbers.
Jahan Dotson, so dope. He's
good. He's really good. And then the Washington beats are speculating Carson Wentz might start, which would make Curtis Samuel a really strong play. He has the softer matchup in the slot. San Francisco is really vulnerable there, and his numbers with Wentz are really good, way better than with Heineke, especially by like target share and stuff like that. He's still getting 4 carries that aren't doing anything, but like that's something you have to factor into the projection. And I just like this. I'm going to have a unique build. I do think these 2 running backs are where all the safety and upside is, and the value. And come what may, if like Justin Jefferson ruins me or a high priced quarterback ruins me, that's okay. Like, this is unique, and at the time I think is optimal.
I am curious if there's a way to fit Justin Jefferson onto this build.
I know. So I'm
messing around with it right now.
I think it is possible. I think I'm going to definitely have those lineups, just because like that is so unique. Although every time I do this, it's like Jefferson scores 3 points, and it's like, and the cheap punts score like 23, and it's like, ugh.
Yeah, I will say, so one of the ways to free up salary is the defense is if the Bears and Bills are playing in weather, Josh Allen takes more sacks and throws more interceptions than I think people realize. Obviously, the Bears don't get a lot of sacks, but at 2K in salary, the Bears could definitely put up 5 to 7 points. And not like, as long as they're not getting negative points, right? And as long as there's not a defense under 3K that's putting up like 15 to 20, if all the popular like chalky sub 3K defenses all put up, 6 points, 8 points, 9 points, and you save down to the Bears and you get 5 points, you're in great shape. So I've actually got threw in Jared Goff at quarterback just to get a sense of like a cheap quarterback who can hit. Threw in Noah Fant at tight end. Threw in, let's see, DJ Shark paired with Jared Goff. Bears defense, we've got still 4,150 left over at wide receiver and flex. So that's Goff, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, DJ Shark, Noah Fant, Bears defense. And if you like Dotson and you like some of these other cheaper guys, right, like you actually could say, well, Dotson should really be priced at like 5,400 in a spot where Washington won't be able to run the ball against the 49ers. You've kind of look at the salary differently than the salary that they're giving you. And yeah, I mean, there's definitely an interesting path to take here. Obviously, it's a very different path. Marquise Goodwin is 4,300. So obviously don't dupe this roster, anybody who's listening to this, but this fits. Okay, you ready for this? Goff, Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, DJ Shark, Jahan Dotson, Marquise Goodwin, Noah Fant, and the Bears defense, right? Like Godwin can score 20, Dotson can score 20, Fant can score 15 in a game. I mean, Goodwin in a game where Goodwin is scoring 20, Fant can still score 15. And then if you get, and Shark, we know can score 20. So if you get 35s to 40s from Jefferson and Derrick Henry and Christian McCaffrey, I mean, you're sitting pretty with this type of roster. So yeah, some fun and unique ways to go on this slate. On the flip side, if Justin Jefferson puts up, your typical, like he didn't hit a monster game and he puts up like 18 points, then you end up with a couple like 6K, 7K guys and just have a totally different build as well. So I mean, I like this. I like the way that you've set this up. There's a lot of fun things you can do with a Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey starting point. Definitely not the only way to go this week, but if you box yourself into saying, hey, I'm just definitely going to start here, you still have a lot of flexibility and upside that you can build into that roster.
Another build I attempted with Jefferson and Henry and McCaffrey, it couldn't fit it. Had Minshew stacked with Goddard. So I like Minshew. He's only 4,800. He averages 17.8 fantasy points per career start. That's more than what Justin Herbert is averaging this year. That's more than what Dak Prescott is averaging this year. He had one start with the first stringers last year on just like 25 throws. He scored 19 fantasy points with a near perfect passer rating. Dallas Goedert had the team high target share, caught 6 of 6 targets for 102 yards and 2 scores. And Goddard just looks underpriced to me at 4,500, where he ranks second among all tight ends in fantasy points per game, second in yards per game, priced as the tight end 5 or tight end 6. So that was another way where you can go cheap but still feel good and then have these upside guys.
Yeah, I mean, we've got some noise in the background here, but yeah, there's definitely it's not like that game is going to be just a low scoring game, right? Philadelphia is going to be. It's not like they're going to dominate the game. They're going to be forced to score points in this one, and they're going to be forced to do that on the ground or through Minshew throwing the ball. And like you said, Minshew's not a bad quarterback. Minshew was a quality fantasy starter when he was with the Jags. It was like inconsistent, but there were plenty of 20-pointers in there because he'll take off and run. He'll dive into the end zone. He'll take shots downfield, and he can also distribute the ball underneath. So I think when we talk about, Howie Roseman is the Eagles owner. Is that right? He's always, Jeff Lurie is the Eagles owner. And Jeff Lurie's always felt that it's extremely important to have like one of the top backups in football, which is part of what happened the Carson Wentz and Nick Foles year. But he's always prioritized backup quarterback play in terms of like, hey, quarterback injuries happen and you need a quarterback who can then guide you. Like they've prioritized Minshew as a guy who they feel can step in and actually lead this offense, right? It's not like he's their contingency plan of like, well, hopefully Hurts doesn't get injured and this guy has to step in and now our season's dead. It's like they still think that they can win games with Minshew, and I think that they still have a plan for how they'll run this offense. So, a lot to like in this spot as well. 4,800 is a great price tag. I remember that game last year. It was Sunday morning when we found out that Minshew was going to be starting, and I pivoted a bunch of rosters to Minshew and Goddard stacks that week, and ended up being a great way to go. So, Minshew at 4,800, very interesting. Any other thoughts on this week's slate before we get out of here?
Yeah, the question I don't know is like, there's definitely a potential where Minshew comes in and we should be bumping all of the pass catchers projections by a wide margin, where it's like, okay, similar accuracy, but way more throws because Jalen Hurts isn't running the ball 9 times per game. But there's also the possibility where it's like, all right, they don't fully trust Minshew, so they lean even heavier on Miles Sanders. And I just don't know, but you have to factor that into the range of outcomes. Closing thoughts, I'll just say Graham Barfield had a great stat he just tweeted. Saints Browns has an over-under of 31.5. This would be the first time in 14 years we've seen a total below 32 points, if this is how it closes, which means the Kendall Hinton Broncos game, where a wide receiver was quarterback, had an over-under over 32 points. Like, damn, they think Deshaun Watson stinks. Andy Dalton, by the way, ranks top 5 in PFF passer grade over the last 6 or 7 weeks. Like, he's playing well, but 32, damn.
Yeah, that's nobody's going to be on that game. I'll tell you that if that stays there. No, that's interesting to me because I do feel like, I know that the Browns have been kind of hiding Deshaun Watson, but I do feel like there's a much greater chance of a blow up there than anticipated. Real quickly on the Eagles thing. I mean, I feel like I've paid as close of attention to this team and how they structure things and how they run things as close of attention as anybody. And I don't think people realize how pass heavy their play calling is early in games. One of the stats that I think is super interesting that I brought up recently is when they played Houston, their first drive, they threw the ball 13 times on their first drive of that game. And obviously Hurts finished with under 27 or under 28 pass attempts in that game because then they were up by so much, right? But one of the things that we see with the Eagles is they really do call an aggressive pass heavy game plan at the beginning of games, unless the opponent just totally funnels things towards the ground. And then so much of their rushing is built off of Jalen Hurts, right? So then they're able to say, okay, now let's balance the fact that we've established the threat of the pass, and now let's run Jalen Hurts a lot more. But if they don't have that in a division game, right, where they don't necessarily need to win it, because they still are probably going to have the division locked up even if they lose. In my mind, Nick Sirianni is not going to say, hey, let's go into a shell and let's run the ball. Like, Nick Sirianni is extremely aggressive as a coach. I would think that he would want to say, let's show Minshew that we have a high level of confidence in him. Let's show this passing attack that we have a high level of confidence in them. And let's come out slinging the ball here. So yeah, at 4,800 against this Cowboys defense that just got torched by a really good quarterback in Trevor Lawrence with some good weapons and a good scheme. But, when you talk about good scheme, you can't get much better than what the Eagles have here, and they know how to use these weapons. So, yeah, I mean, I think that Minshew could be kind of a skeleton key here that unlocks a lot of things. Obviously, this is Tuesday, so take all this with a grain of salt. But Minshew's a very interesting way to start rosters this week, and probably the way that I'll start our DFS Lab roster build tomorrow on that show, because interesting to see what you can kind of work with and unlock with that one. All right, with that, as always, thanks for hanging out with us. We will see you back here next week. We will see you on Fantasy Points throughout the week. We will see you on 1 week season, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Saturday.